Hello and welcome to Myth Monsters. My name is Erin and I'll be your host for these little snack bite-sized podcasts on folklore and mythical monsters from around the world. These podcasts focus on the actual cryptids, folklore and mythic monsters from global mythology, rather than focusing on the full stories of heroes and their big adventures. I'll also be dropping in some references that they have to recent culture and where you can see these represented in modern day content so that you can learn more and get as obsessed as I am about these absolute legends of the mythological world. It's been another year of Myth Monsters, if you can believe it. I can't. It's absolutely insane. The fact that I'm still able to do this and have an audience that is continuing to grow every day is just amazing. Thank you for all your continuing or joining on this journey with me, and I promise to bring many more monsters your way. So far, we've got 141 episodes in over 120 countries and very nearly 100,000 downloads. But we've got more to go, and I can't wait to continue. I do have a surprise for you to celebrate the 3rd year anniversary that I've been alluding to for the last few weeks, but to make things fun, I'll leave this to the end of the episode for you to find out what it is. All the anticipation is killing me. But let's get into it. What are we talking about for this very special? Destiny has already told us, but it's the Fates. Where are they from exactly? Well, that's a more difficult question to answer. When we think of the Fates, most people think of the Greek goddesses, which is technically true, and it is the usual associated mythology we're talking about when we're talking about the Fates. However, there are Fates or Fate-type gods within other mythologies that are very similar to this, that we're going to cover within this episode. Hence why it's called the Fates, and we're not talking about the Moirai specifically. So because of this, I'm going to go into each one in their own mythos, rather than talking about the Fates as a whole. The only thing that all of these have in common is that they are always women, and they have the power over divinity and the fate of all humans. They also have the utmost respect of the gods, which is interesting considering they are technically lower in their god status. But we're going to go over all of these in Greek, Roman, Norse, and strangely and untouched before, Baltic mythology. So let's buckle in and go for it. We talked about the Greek Fates first, so let's talk about them. They were called the Moirai in Greek, and they were represented by 3 sisters, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, or the Spinner, the Allotter, and the Inevitable. Clotho spun the thread of life into a spindle. Lachesis measured it and would determine the length of the life with her measuring rod, and Atropos was the cutter. She would also choose the manner of each person's death, cutting it with a pair of deadly sharp shears. There's not much in regards to how they look, but it's believed that they are depicted as the stages of life, with Clotho as a permanently 9-month pregnant woman, Lachesis as a middle-aged woman, and Atropos as an old crone, wearing a hooded black cloak. They would spend their days spinning, measuring and cutting, but they also had at their beck and call the Erinyes, or the Furies and goddesses of vengeance, to finish off any mortals who had committed grievous sins such as familicide, murder, jealousy, anger and xenia. And I'll get into why later, but they were very much around to finish off any mortals that weren't going to have their wires cut by old age. Hopping over very similarly to Roman mythology, where the Fates were called Parcae, and we're talking about Nonna, Decima and Morta. They did the same thing as the Greek Fates, spinning thread and recording mortal lives, and the Roman gods were actively afraid of the power that the Fates had, because they could also predict and end the lives of gods and their children, even though they are immortal. These sisters could be seen with items that pertain to their roles, such as the thread for Nonna, an eyeglass for Decima, and Morta with her life-ending scissors. Now, heading north to the Norse mythology world, we have the Norns. They're a bit different to our spinners, and their job was to water the great world tree Yggdrasil to stop it from rotting away. They were described not as gods, but as Jotun, which were the frost giants from the realm of Jotunheim, and they serve the Jotun gods. This meant that they were, of course, massively tall, and generally pretty powerful, but their names were Earth, Verthandi, and Skuld. By looking after the world tree, they protected all life in the Norse realms by allowing the tree to do the divining for them. They were known, though, to sometimes come out of their little hiding hole in between realms and come down and bless the birth of a child if you were immensely lucky. And now let's zip over to the Baltics, which counts as some of the countries in Eastern Europe, such as Latvia and Lithuania. And in this mythos, there was technically only one goddess of fate, Lema, who was also linked to childbirth, marriage and death, as well as being the patron of pregnancy. She and her two sisters, Carta and Dekla, were the fate sisters we know, and they would look after each part of a person's life, with Dekla looking after children, Carta over adulthood, and Lema over the elderly. They were very often referred to as the three Lema, so it's debated whether this might mean that they are all copies of one goddess. Lema were also often mixed up with Lemay, who is the god of good fortune within the same mythology, Dahlia, the god of fate, and Guillotine, the god of death. However, there was one big negative of the three Lema, and they were known for giving contradictory information, leaving some people's lives completely in the balance with irreversible prophecies that actually even the Lema themselves couldn't take back. So there is a bit of chaotic in this one. Now let's move on to origins for all of these. It will be a bit different than our usual structure for origin and history this week, and that's because of the general structure of what I'm doing in this episode. So I'll be covering them in the same mythology chunks in regards to their location, about their etymology, history, and any stories rather than doing it section by section and then taking it apart by monster. It just becomes a whole horrible thing. I'll do them in the same order though, so we will start with the Greek. Morai in ancient Greek means destinies, apportioned or lots, which comes from the root word meros or moros, meaning fate and doom. And their names are all just linked to what they do. So Clotho means spinner, Lachesis means allotter, and Atropos means inevitable. They are considered to be the children of the Greek goddess of the night, Nyx, and are literally born from the dark. This makes them sisters of the Erinyes, which is why I said I'd come back to them later, as well as the god of death Thanatos and Nemesis, the goddess of retribution, just to name a few of their most famous siblings. In other tellings, they were the children of Zeus, king of the gods, and the titaness Themis, who was the embodiment of law and order, and therefore their sisters were Eumonia, god of lawful order, Dike, god of justice, and Irene, god of peace. We know that they exist from ancient Greek writers such as Homer, Hesiod, Plato, and Aeschylus, who were all around in about 650 BC, during what we'd consider the Greek Golden Age. The Fates have made their way into many different myths though, including that of the fall of Troy, when Apollo, god of light, warns Patroclus the soldier not to sack Troy as he was over his portion with the Fates, which, of course, led to Patroclus falling in battle when he did decide to go in. Patroclus was also involved in another one's fate, that of Sarpedon, one of Zeus's children and a demigod. Zeus was told by the Fates that Sarpedon would fall to Patroclus' blade, and yet could do absolutely nothing to stop it, and was devastated when his son did fall at Troy. This is all very similar to the Roman tellings of the Parcae though, although Parcae doesn't seem to have a literal translation into English, just straight into the Greek Moirai, which makes sense as they have a massive overlap between the two cultures. But let's get into their names and etymology. Nona means ninth, decima 10th, and morta very literally means death. Again, we don't have a definitive date on when they came into history, much like the Greeks, but the same Greek poets from the same time wrote about them in exactly the same context as the Moirai, and even within the same myths. They do just chop and change the names from Jupiter to Zeus from time to time. A big difference is the lasting culture. In Roman religion, Nona would determine the person's lifespan on their Deus Lucretius, which is the day that the child was named, and always occurred on the 9th day from birth for a boy and the 8th day for girls. We're not sure why there was a difference for the genders, however, it meant that the babies were almost safe from fate for the first 8 or 9 days before the Fates decided what to do with them. But going over to something a bit more different, let's head over to the Norns, which we believe comes from the Old Norse, meaning to twine. However, it is sometimes believed to be from the Swedish word norna, which means to communicate secretly, which does imply how we communicate about fate. It's a silent conversation, which is my favourite meaning of all of these. Their names are Earth, meaning fate, Verdandi, meaning to become, and Skuld, meaning that which should become or needs to occur. That one's a little bit vaguer. They come from the Poetic Edda, which are pieces of poetry and prose from around the 10th century when the Vikings were about, meaning they do go very far back, just not as far back as the Greek and Roman, but still very old. We actually have a great example of them doing their thing, which is an exact extract from the Edda itself, and this extract is in relation to the dragon Fafnir, who is dying after getting stabbed by the hero Sigmund. Tell me then, Fafnir, for wise thou art famed, how much thou knowest now, who are the Norns, who are helpful in need, and the babe from the mother bring. Fafnir spake, of many births the Norns must be, nor one in race they were, some to gods, others to elves, are kin, and Valin's daughters some. This is just one example of the Norns throughout the Edda, such as them appearing, but we also have another one of them being actively described. It goes like this. Thence come the maidens, mighty in wisdom, 3 from the dwelling down neath the tree. Earth is one named, Verdandi the next. On the wood they scored, and Skuld the third. Laws they made there, and life allotted to the sons of men, and set their fates. The Norns are actually the very rare example we have of the Norns and the Fates in general from any culture being talked about, and us still being able to find an extract of them. So enjoy this one, I really did. Lastly though, let's talk about the Baltic goddesses, Laima, where they aren't actually much talked about because there really isn't much information on them, unfortunately. Baltic mythology, we haven't covered it very often, is quite a tricky one to find information on, as it's just not as popular or commonly translated into English, which means it's a struggle to find content on them if you are not from that part of the world or speaking that language. What we do know about Laima is that she'll go back to before the Christianization of the Baltics, which was in around the 15th century, making her possibly our most recent fate goddess. There were rituals for her up until the 19th century, with women offering livestock, towels or woven fabric and materials to her to ease childbirth or pregnancy pains. It was forbidden for a man to take part in these rituals, and so it was performed in a sauna with only women present, which for me sounds great. It's also said that Lemur was the original creator and birther of mankind, which came after the Great Flood, which we know from the Bible, but in a different version in Lithuanian mythology. What we know about all of the interpretations of fate goddesses is that they were made to represent the stages of life: birth, aging, and death. They are the natural order of the world in a humanoid form, with power that even the gods cannot control, as just no one has the power over fate. We do actually have a few other fate goddesses throughout other mythologies. I've not covered them specifically because either there is a caveat to them being just the one goddess, which makes it a bit weird, but also where they're actually fully rooted into something else and fate is just an added power. I don't want to cover those fully, but I'll talk about them here. We've got Maat from Egyptian mythology, who was the goddess of truth, order, and harmony, as well as regulating the stars, seasons, and mortal behaviour, hence her link to the Fates. She is one of the pivotal gods to witness the weighing of the heart ceremony, which a person has upon their descent to the underworld when they die, and as the feather of truth that the person's heart was weighed against was one of hers, it determined what kind of afterlife they would have, either going into the Duat in perfect harmony, or the underworld having their heart eaten by Ammit, destined to walk in shame for the rest of their lives, or afterlives. She's a chthonic goddess, realistically, and this is one of her most important jobs, so I thought we should at least do a little shout out for her, considering we do not tend to cover just gods on this podcast. The Fates are kind of excusable enough as monsters that we can get away with them, especially with their interpretations in modern media. We also have Hatina and Hulatura from Hurrian mythology, which is some of the Eastern Middle East that we've not really ventured into yet in the podcast. These two goddesses of fate and midwifery are from part of this world, and are interesting because there are still two of them, making them fit a little bit into our fates criteria. They also lived in the underworld as chthonic goddesses, and looked over the fate of people from there. They were often blamed for early deaths or disease, as it was considered divine wrath whenever there were deaths or illness affecting a whole community, and it was only fair to blame the goddesses of fate. The really cool thing about these two is that they were responsible for the shaping of the fetus during pregnancy, as well as predetermining the child's fate, which is quite cool and hands-on, and I respect it. Lastly, we have the Matres, or the Matrone, from Celtic mythology, and so little is known about these deities, but we know that they were around from around the 5th century AD, and they were always mentioned in groups of 3 and presenting female. We're not sure of their names or what they really were tasked to do, but we know that they would usually be responsible for childbirth and motherhood, as they would be depicted with children and holding baskets of overflowing fruit, wrapped in snakes and wearing large headdresses. We assume, because of all this imagery, that they are goddesses of maidenhood, fertility, the underworld, children, and fate. We also know that they were worshipped with animal sacrifice and burning incense in larger temples, but they didn't have any specifically dedicated to them, making them what we believe to be lesser deities. But of course, don't tell them that. If you did want to find some temples that were dedicated to fate goddesses, Greece is the place to be, as there were plenty strewn across Thebes and Sparta back in the day in ancient Corinth. There are also 3 asteroids named after Clotho, Lachesis and Atropos, which were discovered in 1868, so that's fun too. They've not made an appearance since 1868, but it's a fun astrology fact. This trope is also most likely responsible for the Three Sisters weird witch trope, which of course we see popularised in Macbeth by Shakespeare, but still continues in media today, which leads us quite nicely onto that. We've got a few things for the Fates themselves this week, but not enough to fill this out, so I've popped in some other trope that they fall into, which is the weird Three Sisters thing, so I've peppered these in too. For art, have a look at The Three Fates by Paul Thuman, The Triumph of Death from 1520, The Night of Enitharmon's Joy by William Blake from 1795, The Norns by Johannes Goetz from 1889, The Norns Under the World Oak Yggdrasil by Ludwig Berger from 1882, Die Helden und Götter des Nordens by Amalia Schopp from 1832, and sorry, there are two more that I have to mention, and they are The Three Parquet by Marcio Biggio from 1540, and The Three Parquet Spinning the Fate of Marie de Medici by Peter Paul Rubens from 1622. But all of these beautiful portraits, and they are all classic portraits. I really recommend looking at them if you're into art, but there are some awesome and really creepy independent bits out there if you want to have a look for this monster too. In movies, we have Hercules, Intolerance, The Craft, Maleficent, The Witches of Eastwick, Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief, Oz the Great and Powerful, Throne of Blood, Hocus Pocus, The Wizard of Oz, Shrek, The Black Cauldron and Sleeping Beauty. For TV, we have Blood of Zeus, Oh My Goddess, American Gods, The Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power, Witches of East End, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, Demon Slayer, Ulysses 31, The Legend of Vox Machina, Black Clover, Doctor Who, Motherland Fort Salem, Supernatural, Hercules the Animated Series, Percy Jackson the Lightning Thief, Cyber Chase, Criminal Minds, The Simpsons, Steven Universe, Gargoyles, Once Upon a Time, Winx Club, Blackadder, Free Spirit, Kamen Rider Gotchard, Iron Fist, Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, Are You Afraid of the Dark, and Legends of Tomorrow. In video games, we have ones such as World of Warcraft, King's Raid, Shin Megami Tensei, God of War 1, 2 and Ragnarok, Guild Wars 2, Final Fantasy X2, Loom, The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, Fallen London, King's Quest VII The Princeless Bride, The Legend of Zelda, and Warriors Orokoshi. And lastly, my book recommendation for the week is Greek Mythology, The Gods, Goddesses and Heroes Handbook by my fellow podcaster Liv Albert for the Greek, The Romans and Their Gods by R.M. Uglevi for the Romans, and lastly, Norse Gods and Goddesses Guide to Understanding Scandinavian Deities and the Viking Religion by Ingvar Akelsson for the Norse. But now it's time for Do I Think They Existed? Well, this one is difficult for me because I am a Hellenic pagan, so I do believe in the Greek gods myself, and the Moirai are definitely included in that. I'm also one of those people who do believe heavily in fate, destiny, and preordained structure. So the idea of three goddesses, or sometimes just one or two it seems, makes sense to me. The idea that you are very literally born this way gives me a sense of massive relief. But I'm also not one of those people who will actively go and seek out a psychic who will tell me when I die. No, thank you. I think fate is a really good thing to live your life by, as a driver to all of the things you want to do. But it can also be an excuse to not do anything, so it is a tricky system. What I have always loved about the fates in any concept is the idea of the three weaving women. A pregnant woman, a normal middle-aged woman and a crone. The idea of three goddesses within any mythology as a group of sisters, or even duplicates of the same being, such as Hecate, really fascinates me. So my long answer is I probably do believe in them, yes. I don't like to believe that they're ready with all of our threads at any time to go snip, but it's just something I have come to terms with, I suppose. They're also the ultimate unjudging entity. Your actions are predetermined by them, and they are the writers, meaning that the gods truly do make us any way they see fit. I actually have a tattoo of the thread of fate being held between the fates' hands on my arm somewhere, but I'd love to say it's just because I like the fates, and I do have a mythology sleeve, but it's really a big nod to my favourite Disney film, which is Hercules, to be completely honest. But what do you think? Do the fates continue to spin our destinies to this day? Let me know on Twitter, I would love to know what you think. I really hope you enjoyed this birthday episode. I decided to do the fates as one collective being for this anniversary, because they are one of my favourite, quote-unquote, monsters, and I was desperate to cover them, and what a better time to cover something that I want to do than the anniversary and my upcoming date of birth. I am 29 this year, it's a little bit sad, but you guys have known me since I was 26, so that's quite fun. Okay, so, I promised I would give you a big reveal, so it is time to reveal it, and I hope you are as excited as I am, but drumroll please. On the 25th of March, which is the podcast's official third birthday, I will be launching Myth Monsters merch. Super exciting! I've designed them all myself, and I really hope you go and have a look at least. I've even got a discount code for the first week for 20% off everything with MMLaunch20, and that's in all caps. You can find all of that on mythmonsters.co.uk on the 25th of March. And if you do get something, please take a picture and send it to me. Tag me. I would love to see people wearing it, and I'm very proud of the podcast, so please do let me know, and thank you as always for listening. I'm now on a 2-week break for my sanity, but also for my birthday on the 16th and the anniversary on the 25th. But when we come back, which is on the 4th of April, we are heading down under to Australia to look at a monster that did 100% exist at some point. So then why are we covering it? Find out the answer and come thylacine hunting with me when we come back on the 4th of April. For now, thank you so much for listening, always. It has been an absolute pleasure. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give it a rating on the service you're listening on. I've got the Twitter for any questions or suggestions on what monsters to cover next, and I'd really love to hear from you. The social media handles for TikTok, YouTube, Threads and Instagram are Myth Monsters Podcast, and the Twitter is Myth Monsters Pod. But all of our content can be found at mythmonsters.co.uk, and you can find us on Good Pods, Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon if you want to help me fund the podcast too. Come join the fun though, share this with your pals. They might love me as much as you do. But for now, stay spooky. And I'll see you in 2 weeks, babes.